Assessment of South Africa's organised crime by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime shows that South Africa is now moving up to the quadrant of criminality in the world, and the assessment there is that we have raced past Mexico, Somalia and Libya. The country now competes with places like Guatemala, Brazil and Russia. So let's get a better understanding of just how serious this issue is. And we are joined by the Director for East and Southern Africa Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. Julian Rademeyer speaks to us now. Julian, good morning to you and thank you very much for your time. A discussion we were meant to have yesterday, but we had the focus on ESCOM at that time. Nonetheless, talk to us about South Africa's mafia-type crimes, which are now being compared to that of Italy. How bad is the situation?
Yeah, just to correct one thing, we haven't raced past Mexico or Somalia. Those countries, in terms of the index, which was a separate report, Index of Organised Crime globally, shows that South Africa is still positioned quite well. Those countries are actually further along the line than South Africa. So there's a bit of a misreading of the index there.
Okay.
But what that index does show is that between 2019 and 2021, South Africa has been shifting in terms of a growth in criminality and a severe growth in criminality, but also an erosion of resilience. South Africa is one of those countries, like Italy actually, which is uniquely positioned in the sense that it has a high level of criminality, but it also has a comparatively high level of resilience. And we do that by taking a measure of legislation that's in place, institutions that are in place, the investigations into things like money laundering. And what it shows is that we're in a position now, and I think that's the importance of this assessment at this time, is that those institutions, that ability, that resilience within our society is beginning to erode. We have to take action urgently. This is in many ways a call for action from us. So what we did with this report was we set out to look at the organized crime ecosystem in South Africa, and we identified 15 markets that we believe are the ones that are the gravest threat to our democracy, the gravest threat to our political order, and they're the markets that affect millions of people in this country.
Yeah.
And they're the markets that are flourishing and growing. The point of this exercise is so that we can, rather than looking in a fragmented way at crime in South Africa, we can look at it holistically and get a picture of organized crime today. And it is a frightening picture in many senses.
Yeah. Let's talk about the categories of this organized crime, Julian, if we can. Just moments ago, we had a slide talking about organized crime by province, and I hope I've read this one correctly, and the line that seems to be quite up there is the one that is attached to KwaZulu-Natal. Is it going out of hand there, the issue of organized crime, and what kind of organized crime categories are we talking about in that province?
Yeah. So I think what you are looking at there is the slide that we used during the launch to show the murder rate in South Africa. And KwaZulu-Natal is of particular concern because there's been a 68% increase in murder in that province in the past decade. In South Africa as a whole, there's been a 38% increase in murder. It's important to note that murder has always been very high in South Africa. You can go back to the 1950s, and we've always had a high rate of murder. That peaked in the early to mid-90s with the move into a democratic South Africa, our first democratic elections. And it peaked at a very high rate in around 92, 93, much of that tied to political violence that was occurring. And then there was a sharp decline, a sharp 50% decline between 1994 and 2010, 2011. That year, however, we see quite a sharp change, and that inflection shows the beginnings of an upward curve in murder. Our research suggests that is tied to institutional weaknesses and growing weaknesses in law enforcement, increased vigilante action, organized crime, armed robbery, and violent robbery and an entrenching of violence in South Africa. KwaZulu-Natal is a particular concern because the violence that we're seeing there is in many cases, violence that's tied to assassinations, hitmen, many of them emerging from within the taxi industry, being used to carry out political hits, to carry out hits. We've seen municipal officials who've been assassinated. We've seen environmental activists who've been assassinated. So at very, very high levels. And that is a particular concern as we move, into an election period in the coming years. So I think what we've been particularly in KwaZulu-Natal documenting has been very high levels of politically linked assassinations.
Political hits, whilst we are on that subject, Julian, I see a province that is fast trailing KwaZulu-Natal, and that's the Eastern Cape. Is that a surprise?
In terms of murder, the Eastern Cape is actually quite low down in that period. It was a 32% increase in murder between 2012 and 2022. The provinces that are trailing KwaZulu-Natal from an organized crime murder perspective would be the Western Cape, Gauteng, and Mpumalanga. And that obviously in many ways makes sense. These are the biggest centers. The Western Cape, high levels of gang violence. Gauteng, we're seeing high levels of violence linked into extortion, also violence that ties in with other areas. We've seen recently the murders of Zama-Zamas. And then in Mpumalanga as well, a combination there of hits, a growth in organized crime, cash in transit heists, violent robberies. So certainly those provinces are very much affected. The Eastern Cape as well, a lot of murders there also tied to the taxi industry. And I think one of the things we try to look at in this is legal industries like the taxi industry, but where there is a significant role where illicit industries are taking place, so where murder for hire. The problem with the taxi industry is it's largely unregulated. Efforts by government to regulate the industry have all but failed in the past. So the industry regulates itself, and that's why you very often see conflict over routes, conflict that leads to taxi bosses being assassinated and so on. Yeah.
Kidnappings for extortion, Julian. How worried should we be about this category of organized crime? Is it becoming rampant?
I think kidnapping for ransom is extremely concerning. There's been a spectacular increase since 2020, jumping to around 10,100 incidents in the last crime stats from 2021 to 2022. Previously, we'd seen levels around the 5,000, 6,000 mark. Extortion, which is tied to that in some instances, is also very worrying to us. Extortion generally starts where it targets vulnerable communities. So in South Africa, we saw in the early phases, for instance, immigrant communities, Pakistanis, Somalis being targeted for extortion. Those extortion rings have grown throughout society. We see gangs, for instance, in Mamelodi and Pretoria. You had the Boko Haram gang who were running extortion rackets. We see cases, for instance, in Khayelitsha where Eskom officials are, for instance, being extorted, being told that they have to pay a fee before they can come in and do repairs to electricity lines. And then we have the worrying issues with the construction mafia, where building sites are essentially held to ransom in demand for a payment and a percentage of the building costs and the fees involved. So extortion is something, and extortion is a very difficult crime because it's something that becomes embedded in society. People are too terrified to speak out. So it goes largely unreported. And it spreads very quickly. And you have copycat gangs realizing that they can move into that. Extortion has long been a facet in the Western Cape and Cape Town, particularly in relation to the city's nightlife. During COVID and as a result of bans on alcohol and cigarettes, and new relationships are formed by gangs with people as a result of that, we've seen it spread into the day life of the city, for want of a better description. Yeah. So that, I think, is a very compelling issue that is going to pose long-term challenges unless it's addressed.
Well, let's conclude the conversation then and talk about this. I think you've mentioned it before, that if it is not nipped in the bud, or if it is not dealt with properly, it is an existential problem for our democracy. Should we rely on the South African criminal justice system? Because there does seem to be, in the article here that I've read, there does seem to be a glimmer of hope that as bad as things are, it is not entirely a hopeless situation.
I think, we don't say that lightly. We do think it's an existential threat. We do think it has to be addressed urgently. We do think that government needs to prioritize organized crime specifically as something that has to be tackled with a clear, thought-out long-term strategy. It's not going to be something that is going to be dealt with overnight. It's also not something we can arrest our way out of. So we need a clear strategy in place. We need to bring in civil society. We need to bring in broader societal responses. This is something that affects every single one of us, and it affects every single one of us daily. I think that, we need to come up with new strategies. I think we need to break free of the siloing that very often occurs between our security cluster and our justice agencies. They need to be able to collaborate better. So I think that, in the longer term, we need a strategy that takes into account the whole of government, takes into account the whole of society, develops mechanisms that can be synchronized carefully to avoid that siloing.
All right. And
pull in civil society. But we have to, there's no two ways about it. We have to stick it out.
Julian, Rademeyer, thank you very much for that assessment of the organized crime situation in our country. He's with the East and Southern Africa Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime.